Hey there, this is Dr. Bret's office. I'm Bret Manasseh, and it's time for another question out of Dr. Bret's mailbag. I take questions from anybody and everybody interested in mental health, whether you're a counseling student, whether you've been counseling for a while, but you don't even have to be a counselor. You could just be somebody with thoughts or questions that you want to bounce off of a counselor. A longtime therapist like me, I take on all comers. So tonight we've got a letter from Carrie K., a recent counseling graduate student. She writes, "Dear Dr. Bret, I'm interested in Carl Rogers' counseling approach. I notice you've got lots of videos about it. How has your understanding and use of his person-centered therapy changed over time?" Wow, what a question. I often describe myself as a struggling, sometimes backsliding person-centered therapist because it's not at all an easy therapy to do. You're right, I've got lots of videos on this channel that describe Rogers' ideas. Check them out if you want to know more. But in a nutshell, the heart of person-centered therapy is that all people, like all living things, have a natural tendency to develop into whatever it is that they have the potential to become. All they need are the right conditions. For example, a tree doesn't need to be taught to be a tree. Give an acorn sufficient sun, water, and soil, and it just naturally starts developing into itself. A squirrel doesn't need to be taught to be a squirrel. A fish doesn't learn to swim. Birds don't have to be taught to fly. They just have it within themselves, and it comes out as it's needed in their development. Now, people are a lot more complicated than plants and animals, but at least according to Rogers, a person doesn't need to be taught how to be themselves either. That if they're given the proper conditions, they will be naturally motivated to become themselves, to develop, to move forward in some constructive direction. But instead of a physical environment of sun, water, and soil, a person needs a psychological environment that's to the greatest degree possible genuine and authentic, empathic and understanding, receptive and accepting. Nobody ever gets an ideal psychological environment like that when they're growing up. But the degree to which a child experiences those things is a big indicator of how healthy they become, at least according to Rogers. Thankfully, if a person did not get these conditions when they were growing up, Rogers believed that they could experience them from a therapist later in life and be reconnected to this constructive, directional tendency that has always been inside them. So the therapy that a person-centered therapist tries to provide is a psychological environment in which the client feels seen, heard, understood, and accepted by a person who is genuinely and authentically themselves as much as possible. Doesn't that sound nice? Well, Rogers' ideas are a lot more controversial than they might sound. And like I said, if you want to learn more, see some of the other videos on this channel. But back to Carrie's question, how has my understanding of that theory changed over time? Well, the first thing I had to get over was my initial hatred of it. I hated it. It looked like the counselor was just sitting there looking at the client, saying almost nothing, maybe repeating back what they said, maybe making a comment from time to time, but mostly just sitting there. And it made me mad. So over a period of several years, I tried to practice just about every therapy out there. But I just couldn't find one that seemed to help clients or seemed to fit me. At some point, though, I was thinking back over all the sessions that I had, and I found that the best sessions were the ones where I simply provided those genuine, warm, empathic conditions. And I was shocked at how much clients could figure out all by themselves. At that point, I guess I just had to say, well, damn it, I guess I'm a person-centered therapist then. So that was the first thing about person-centered that changed for me. Once I got over my initial hatred of it, I had to learn that being person-centered doesn't mean I have to pretend to be dumb, to pretend not to know anything else about psychology and just repeat back whatever the client said. Because in the beginning, that's kind of what it looked like, at least from the outside. I learned that I could use what I knew from other theories and other therapists and inform what I chose to reflect. So if a client said something that reminded me of a concept from Adlerian therapy, I could use my knowledge of sibling rivalry to shape what I chose to respond. Let's say a client talks about how much she competed with her sister as a kid, especially for her father's attention. I could, from a person-centered approach, just respond, "Ugh, it sounds like you really had to struggle with your sister. It hurt not to feel as important to him as your sister seemed to be." I'm still being person-centered when I reflect that because I let the client bring up childhood whenever and however she felt like it, and I'm not trying to figure out what this memory means for the client. I'm not trying to analyze it or change it. I'm just holding space for the client to work on the thoughts and feelings around that memory. I'm being person-centered primarily because I trust the client to guide their session and to figure things out for themselves as they go. Here's another example. Say another client regrets not making up with his mother before she died. Now, because I know a little bit about Gestalt therapy, I know that unfinished business, unexpressed thoughts and feelings from the past, can cause a lot of pain in the present. However, a Gestalt therapist would probably get very directive all of a sudden. Set up an empty chair, maybe have the client envision his mother sitting in that chair, and then provoke the client into having a confrontation with his mother in the here and now. A Gestaltist might even have the client swap chairs and respond to himself as he thinks his mother might. Well, from a person-centered approach, I don't think that's necessary. But I can recognize that unfinished business is really troubling the client, and I would be perfectly person-centered by simply reflecting, "Oh, there's so much that you never got to say to your mom. You sound guilty, angry even, that she died before you could talk with her." See? Even if my knowledge of Gestalt therapy is informing what parts of a client's narrative I want to hold space for, I'm still being person-centered because I trust the client to sense whether they need to get those things out in their therapy. I haven't decided in advance that it would be helpful for them if they did, and I certainly wouldn't push them to do it. I just recognize that it's there. Now, Rogers would have his own way of conceptualizing both situations, and each client could be understood from a Rogerian perspective without having to use Adler or Gestalt. I'm just saying that I can be person-centered and still appreciate ideas from other theories too. Here's the third way that my understanding of person-centered therapy has evolved. I learned to be more at peace with Rogers' most controversial statement. He said that other than the core conditions of counseling, genuineness, warmth, and empathy, that nothing else is necessary. That's what prevents most counselors from fully appreciating Rogers, because that's a pretty hard pill to swallow. Okay, Rogers said nothing else is necessary, but necessary for what? Nothing else is necessary to activate a client's own innate tendency to move and change in a positive, constructive direction. Nothing else was necessary for a client to reconnect to their own inner compass, to know for themselves what would be helpful or good or useful for them. So for me, I don't have to interpret nothing else is necessary to mean nothing else could possibly help. I think that's how too many therapists interpret it. And if Rogers ever said that, I think he and I would just have to disagree. For example, the client who regrets not making up with his mom. Let's say I have patiently held space and let him process and process, but he's still stuck. I might say, you know, some people have found that getting things like that off their chest in a therapy session helps them. It might or might not help you, but if you felt up to trying to put into words what you wish you had said to your mom, I'd be willing to hear them. I'm not telling the client what they should do. I'm not setting up an expectation that it would be helpful or even that I hope they would try. I'm just creating an opening and trusting the client to sense for themselves what would be helpful for them in that moment. Now, it's rare that I have to do something like that, because if I'm listening really closely, clients can really get themselves unstuck through pretty much anything, all by themselves. But not equating nothing else is necessary with nothing else could possibly help is a way that I don't find myself tied up in knots. Last of all, I had to get over the fear that I wasn't doing anything by just listening. As a new counselor, I felt I needed to come into the session with a lot of techniques, worksheets, exercises, things like that in my therapist's backpack. That if all I was doing was listening, I'd basically be coming empty-handed with nothing to give the client. Over time, though, I realized that listening closely, letting the client feel seen, heard, accepted, understood, that I was giving them something that probably nobody else in their life could. I'm giving them a psychological environment where they feel safe to unravel all their knotted up issues at their own pace, in their own way, without judgment, criticism, instruction, advice, nothing. Creating a space like that is far from doing nothing. So, Carrie, that's how my understanding of Rogers has evolved over the years. I'm still a struggling person-centered therapist. I might backslide here and there, but I am absolutely convinced that the answer is somewhere within the client, that they can reconnect to it, and that they can resolve whatever they're facing much more exquisitely than I could. They just don't have to do it alone. A counselor like you or me could walk with them while they're doing it. Thanks for the great question. Whether you're a counselor or not, if you're interested in any aspect of mental health, send your question to DrBretsMailbag at gmail.com. I'd love to hear from you. Check out some of my other talks on this channel, like and subscribe, leave your comments below, and I will see you again soon here in Dr. Bret's office.